Good evening and welcome to Law Talk, the show that brings the Constitution, the law, and the events of today to you each month. Tonight we're fortunate to have an expert on the set, so myself, James Barrett, Mark Malakowski, and why don't you introduce
We have Elton Sherwin, who is the executive director of the Carbon Zero Institute. And I was very lucky to make his acquaintance in a show a couple weeks ago. I saw him, I was very impressed, and I invited him on the show, and I said, well, you have to be a good sport because we like to kid around on this show.
Little did I know.
And so we're going to be the party on, don't worry about global warming. He's going to be the serious adult at the table and talk about the risks and problems associated with climate change or global warming. So why don't you give us a little bit of introduction of why you think this is important?
Well, so the situation that we're in is that the climate is going a little wacky on us. And one of the ways I think about it, if you can imagine the climate like you would a seismograph during an earthquake with all the little squiggly lines, and you've got one for temperature and one for rainfall. And what's happening all over the globe is that the squiggles are getting bigger. The extremes are becoming more extreme, and both lines are going up. That is, we're getting more rainfall, interestingly enough, around the world, which you wouldn't believe here in the drought in California. And we're getting more snow in the middle of winter. We're getting longer droughts and warmer temperatures. So the extremes are becoming more extreme, and we've pumped energy into the system. So California, we're going to see 3 to 14 degrees Fahrenheit bump in the temperature this century. That's not just on a few hot days, that's across the entire year.
That'd be more of an average then you're talking about.
Yes, so you're going to, if you live in Sacramento, the middle of the night is going to be 3 to 14 degrees hotter. The winters are going to be 3 to 14 degrees hotter, and the summers are going to be hotter. So that's going to be a real challenge to California, and we're going to see similar things around the world. More floods, more hurricanes, more droughts. We're just going to have wackier weather and hotter weather on average as we go through the century.
Could I ask you a question, Elton? I'd like to know how are these predictions calculated? Because as you know, when you do a calculation on any kind of global warming theory or global warming events, you have to have a calculation that you plug into a climate computer of some sort, and then you have to project from that. So is that how the basis for this argument?
So well, we have the observations that we've seen virtually everywhere in the world where we keep records. The summers have gotten longer, the winters have gotten shorter, the glaciers are melting, and the polar ice caps are melting. Some of the longest records that we have been kept in Europe and in China, things like butterflies and bird migrations, flood levels, and they all indicate that our summers are going to get longer, our winters are going to get shorter, and so we see the actual results. The way we forecast into the future is we've discovered in the 1800s that CO2, which is produced when we burn anything, and we burn a lot of stuff on the planet these days, traps heat. And this was observed over 150 years ago. And we, at the time, really didn't produce enough CO2 to make a dramatic impact on the planet. But we've gotten really good in the last 50 years at just burning a lot of stuff. We burn an amazing amount of stuff around the planet now, from coal to oil to wood to natural gas. And that accumulates in the atmosphere, and that CO2 traps the sun's heat.
Okay, so is that the greenhouse effect that we always hear about, and we've heard about our whole lives, basically?
Well, that's not really true at your age. So a lot of
are you saying I'm very old or very young?
A lot of scientists. A lot of scientists in the 60s and the 70s thought we might slip back into an ice age.
Global
killing,
yeah.
It really has been in the last 30 years where the evidence has gone from being very ambiguous to being really very clear. We've had 10 of the hottest days in the last several hundred years, 10 of the hottest years in the last several hundred years have happened this century. So we've seen a dramatic warming in the last 30 years. And when you look at the charts, you could be a skeptic until 1970. The data up to 1970 was ambiguous. When you now look back from here to 1970, it's very clear the planet has gotten warmer.
Well, I
Okay,
understand.
like as the counterpoint, which is the party on, don't worry about global warming. Party on counterpoint would say that what we see in the global warming is that there's some data, and it's not that conclusive. And anytime you're starting to look at this data, for instance, if you're looking at an analysis of variance, you have a certain amount of noise in the data.
Yep.
And so the noise to signal ratio is pretty high. So it's really hard to make a real clear deduction. And so a lot of people who are skeptical, like myself, fear, like, for example, the EPA is moving really quickly, and they're also not willing to share their data. So we had the EPA Administrator, Jen McCarthy, said the other day, we got to protect this global warming data, quote, from those who are not qualified to analyze it. So that makes people a little bit suspicious that we can't see the data.
Well, does that, excuse me, Mark, is that something along the lines that we don't have the emails that were lost in the IRS as well?
Well, this is a little different. This is a little different. This is a matter that you aren't wise enough to...
yes, we know better than you know.
We're not wise enough to...
That's correct.
So,
we all know that they know better than us because we're not educated.
That makes people really suspicious. And then they talk about the, this EPA Administrator, Jen McCarthy, Ms. McCarthy said there's a social cost of carbon, and she wanted to regulate these power plants. And so, and she said the EPA Clean Power Plan is the science is clear and the risks are clear. But then it got up to the Supreme Court, and was the Utility Air Regulatory Group versus the EPA, and what SCOTUS said, which we call the Supreme Court SCOTUS here, Supreme Court of the United States, said that the EPA's rewriting of this legislation,
that's the Clean Air Act.
Clean Air Act is outrageous, and they want to regulate a significant portion of the American economy. And so the Supreme Court is saying, wait a minute, this is kind of jumping ahead, and now the EPA says we can't see the data. So naturally, people are very, very suspicious of this because people trust the federal government less and less.
So it's hard to know where to start with that, but you guys are both lawyers?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about what a rational lawyer would do. Okay, first of all, the EPA is very good for jobs for lawyers. So you should be very pro-EPA. Second of all, if you look at countries that don't have an EPA, you don't want to live there. So if you're anti-EPA, you can go and spend a little vacation anywhere in China. You can just pick a dart and throw it, and you will go vacation someplace that has smog worse than LA. First time I flew from Hong Kong to Beijing, you take off in Hong Kong, and it's tropical, and it's beautiful, and it's blue, and you cross the border, and all of a sudden, you're just enveloped in this smog. And I think, okay, this is the industrial South China. You know, the air is going to clear because it looks worse than LA out the window. And you fly for an hour, and you're looking out, and it's just as bad. In 2 hours, and it's just as bad. In 3 hours, and it's just as bad. And you go all the way, and you land in Beijing, and you've never seen smog like you have. So you can rag on the EPA and the regulatory process, but wealthy Chinese are buying real estate in the West and moving their children to the West, and one of the reasons that they're doing it is because they don't have an EPA.
I'm going to agree with you 100% on that. I don't have any question about the smog levels in both China and India, which is non-regulated at all.
Yeah.
But there's always a question about the people that are regulating us. And you say,
They're
well,
lawyers.
I can
see why you're skeptical.
Wait a minute, and I am skeptical because lawyers all have two opinions.
They're the worst.
Theirs and whatever they are paid to have. Okay, so when we look at these things, you have to realize, I don't care if every last person down to the janitor at the EPA is a lawyer. That doesn't impress me. What impresses me is whether or not they can open their minds to a fair, objective position and not create a position they're paid to do by the party in power at the time.
Well, there's
because
an
you
issue.
can easily argue that.
There's also an issue, a constitutional issue. I mean, here you have the executive branch of the EPA legislating through regulation. That's not constitutional. That's lawless. And so anytime you see that happening, of course, people are frightened because they're like, wait a minute, you know, that's not how it's supposed to be done. Congress is supposed to legislate, not the EPA. And so when people start seeing a regulatory agency going beyond their legal authority and basically saying, we have guns, we have guys with guns, you got to do what we say or we'll shoot you, people start to say, well, wait a minute, why are they using these mob tactics instead of passing it through Congress?
You know, Mark,
So
and
I
doing the
know
way it's supposed to be done.
I've met a lot of folks from the EPA, and I just have two observations.
Yeah.
One is that they've been concerned about pollution and climate change, whether it's been a Democratic administration or Republican administration. My vague recollection is a Republican administration that actually set up the EPA. So it's not an issue of it just being driven with the particular agenda of one politics. And I'm sure that there are people in the EPA that have guns, but I have never met any. And I'm sure of the.
Well, they're not armed yet.
If you rank the federal government,
They're armed.
yeah. So.
Well,
I used to work as an inspector, so I worked the EPA.
Okay,
I
well,
used to be an
you know what?
investigator.
Let's hang on. Let's move on to this carbon tax, because I think this is kind of the basis that everyone's been told that's coming our way in a store near you. So, Elton, can you tell us about a carbon tax?
So we have three ways of regulating pollution. You can ban it, direct regulation. Almost all pollution worldwide today is regulated by direct regulation. We don't say to a polluter, we're going to tax how much you put in the sewer system, or we're going to tax how much arsenic or mercury. We just set a level and we make it a clear-cut case. The two competing ways to just direct regulation are you tax the stuff, and if you want the amount of sulfur or whatever it may be to decline, you start out with a little itty-bitty tax, and then you raise the tax a little bit until people stop doing it. And we have very little history with doing that, but the couple of instances where it's been tried, what happens is people seem to figure out ways they hate paying the tax. They find ways to dramatically reduce whatever pollutant it is that is taxed.
Doesn't that lead to the carbon credits then, Elton, where you can actually buy the right to pollute, and that's in opposition to the carbon tax, so now you're talking about being able to buy the pollution rights.
So that's the third way, and that is you have a cap and a trade. And a cap and a trade is unbelievably complex. But the one thing that we know for sure about cap and trade, we don't know if it works yet, but we do know that of all of the mechanisms, it employs the most lawyers. The Europeans have implemented it, and the regulations on just how to do carbon credits and cap and trade fill volumes, and the jury is still out on how effective cap and trade is going to be.
Well, I would say when you're regulating pollutants, what a permit is basically room to pollute. You have one curve that says, okay, you know, people are going to live to be 75 years old or 70 years. They're going to be 140 kilograms. They're going to breathe so much air. They're going to drink so much water per day. And so we want everyone to live to this ripe old age of 70 or 75. And then we have all the different pollutants that might bother them, and we want them to die of everything at once. And then what the difference is between those levels, and basically you put a bubble or a dome over it, and you say you're getting this much, like you were talking about, NOxes or SOxes, SO4, SO2, SO3, NO2, NO3, stuff like that. And you say, okay, whatever the difference is between what will kill people early and what's in the atmosphere, that's what you can permit. That's called room to pollute, right? And so that's pretty established. Like you're saying, you know, there's limits on SO2 and SO3. There's limits on
arsenic,
cyanides, and mercury.
All kinds of things.
And there's acceptable amounts, and then there's non-acceptable amounts.
What you have is
and sometimes you have to stair-step it down because you don't have either the money or the technology to get where you know you need to be at the end of the
But I mean,
decade.
what happens is you have like an LD50, what kills 50% of a population, you divide that by 10, you call that safe.
I'm glad that 50% of the population is opposed to having everyone die at once, where you started with that argument, which I was very concerned about. I want to come back to the I want to come back to the carbon tax. I know there's an explanation. I want to go back to the carbon tax.
You buy everything at the same time.
So you would think
at the same time you buy arsenic or global warming.
Carbon taxes are like one of the most feared things on the planet, but the people who actually have them, particularly where there's 100% rebate, have been very pleased with it. So what British Columbia does, and it mimics sort of what Sarah Palin did in Alaska. And for those of you who missed what she did, she taxed the oil companies, she took it all, and she divvied it up and sent a check to everyone in the country.
Isn't that what Senator Stevens
Everyone in Alaska.
No,
everyone in Alaska.
Everyone in Alaska.
But Senator Stevens
Oh,
did
but
that.
he died in a plane crash mysteriously.
Moving. So what British Columbia does is they tax carbon pollution, They take the amount that comes in and they divvy it up and they send the same check for the same amount to everyone in British Columbia. So it's what's called a 100% rebate. It's very popular. About 85 to 90% of the people end up wealthier.
Okay,
who are the people?
Now,
who are the people? You wonder.
Who owns the carbon credits right now? How many carbon credits
There's no carbon credits created there. It's a straight, simple.
It's just a straight tax.
For every,
You're just talking about a straight tax that's rebated.
Every pound of CO2 that is produced is a ton, pound, you know.
Ounce?
And a gallon of gasoline, when you burn it, produces about 20 pounds. So to give you kind of sense. So if you can imagine a nice big bag of briquettes, and you go in and you put 30 gallons of gasoline into your car, which you're going to burn, you should at the same time put 30 bags of briquettes into the back, because that's what is going to go out your tailpipe.
That's how many carbons.
How much carbon is going to go out. So you get taxed on that. Surprisingly, if you were to envision, like, what would a fair tax be for taking 30 bags of briquettes and spraying the stuff into the air, and you said in any rational world what we would tax for that, the carbon taxes are very reasonable. But 80 to 90% of the population ends up better off. Guess who ends up worse off in a carbon tax?
Probably the corporations.
Bad people.
People who fly a lot, right? Because flying, you burn a tremendous amount.
Air Force One?
Yeah, you would not want to have to pay the carbon taxes for the first family.
Can I interject a question?
And
because you talk about
people in British Columbia.
Wait a minute, hang on. You're talking about British Columbia. You're talking about British Columbia.
Because they've done it.
I'm talking about California.
California hasn't done it.
And you know what California wants to do? They want to do it. And you think we're going to all get a rebate check out of California, out of Sacramento?
California.
Are you trying to tell me I'm going to be taxed in California or taxed in any state, and they're going to send us back the money? So this is, and who gets that money?
That's like your Social Security
the California system was designed by a good Republican administration and lawyers, and it's a.
Why do you always keep saying that, lawyers? You know what? Let's go back to Rome. What does that? Kill all the lawyers.
Oh, law talk.
That's right.
That's why we need. Okay, so it was.
Are you blaming the lawyers for pollution?
Oh no, of course
not. Are you sure you're not blaming the lawyers?
No, when you invited me on here, you didn't tell me there'd be two lawyers. I would have brought, a bodyguard or something.
How many tons of hot air does every lawyer exude just talking in a month?
Yeah, that's what we should do. We should just tax that.
Is that worse than cows when they?
Cows are worse.
Okay, well, Elton, go back to what. I don't want to talk about British Columbia. I want to talk about California.
Okay, so California went with the European system of a cap and trade Lawyer Full Employment Act. And if you look at the British Columbia regulations for a carbon tax and the California regulation for cap and trade,
it's fairly shocking.
It is fairly shocking, but the California regulators are brighter and more sophisticated than the European ones, and there is a chance.
So you make sure there won't be a rebate.
There will be no rebate.
There is a chance that the California system may work.
Well, hell, you want
Brussels.
You want to build the train from LA to. So you might as well give them a cap and trade. And you want to give them a tax, and let's build that train. And how long will it take to get $100 million with a cap and trade?
Okay,
you never know.
I think it's $100 billion.
Let's go back. Let's go back to the IPCC.
Yeah, it's probably $100 billion. What do you think about that train?
Let's go back to the IPCC. The UN IPCC did the climate models.
Well, before we go there, Mark, let's just start right at the top on the IPCC.
You're not giving Mark a chance.
Well, no, Mark. We're going to let Mark lead right into this IPCC, because the IPCC seems to be a disjointed organization. Mark, why don't you tell us about the IPCC? What is the IPCC?
IPCC is an international organization that wants to promote the theory of global warming, and they base it on climate models, and they said these are scenarios, not predictions. And the professor, Chris Fallon, said the data doesn't matter. And they said, we're not basing our recommendations on data, we're basing them on the climate models. Now, when I was back in doing my Bachelor of Science for Oceanography, I had Dr. Zamet. I won't tell you our nickname for him, but it rhymed. And because he'd always make a snake and he'd go, damn. So we call him that. But he spent several sessions in our 40 physics class deriving the theory of relativity on the board. But then when I talk to climate people, and I invite a climate professor to come on the show, and if they can derive the calculation
no climate scientist other than me has been naive enough to show up with the movie. I can understand. I can understand
We
some
warned you ahead of time.
Naive is not really the word. What it means is they're fearful to show up on the show. So let's use the correct word for
They
that.
showed the good judgment not to show up in the show. They showed the good judgment. Okay, so, but I mean,
Where are we going with this?
If Dr. Zammit can show a bunch of 19-year-old or 20-year-old Bachelor of Science students how Einstein's
Theory of
derived
relativity.
the theory of relativity, why can't some scientists from the Global Warming IPCC come down here and get a chalkboard and derive it and let us look at every citation, look at every
Piece of data that supports it.
and just explain it as he goes, okay? And so these theoretical climate models have predicted
I think there are
global
probably a lot of reasons why scientists wouldn't come down and try and explain that on this TV
Okay.
show. But
but the theoretical
The show's not long enough.
But that doesn't mean that it isn't explainable.
Okay, then the theoretical climate models have predicted global temperatures would rise as a result of the increase of CO2. But in fact, global temperatures haven't increased significantly in the last 15 years, and CO2 has. So the model, and so you say, well, the model doesn't match the facts in the last 15 years. And so the proponents of global warming or climate change say, well, and I always mess up the pronunciation. They claim that the last 15 years was anomalous. So wait a minute, you've got a model and you want to tax us and you want to raise the price of everything by raising gasoline up to $10 a gallon, but the last 15 years don't count because they're goofy?
Okay,
Come on.
so let's address two things. One is the calculations that CO2 traps heat is a very simple calculation, vastly simpler than Einstein's theory of relativity. It's been understood since the 1880s, and there is virtually no debate that when you add CO2 to a body of air, it traps more heat than when you take the CO2 out of the air. The last 10 years have been the hottest that we've seen or 10 of the last 15 years have been the hottest we've seen in several centuries. It has gotten hotter, it's hotter, and it's going to get hotter as we move through the century.
Well, I have a question. Did you know the glaciers were substantially less in historical times than they are today? We also know that the glaciers also covered North America and covered places. So we do know that glaciers grow and retreat on their own in a natural cyclical motion.
Yes.
So you can't just say that, oh, by the way, in the last 30 years, the reason the glaciers allegedly have receded is because of man-made global warming, when in fact, the exact is opposite. Right now, the glaciers have increased in Antarctica by 50%. The thickness has increased.
You have been watching too much Fox News.
Fox News? Whoa, time out. Wait a minute.
The glaciers are not getting larger. They are getting smaller everywhere on the planet, and both polar ice caps are melting. There is one little exception which we can explain, which is which the models for years have told us that as the planet warms, the ice on the very bottom of the South Pole is going to get thicker, and indeed it has.
Yeah, but can I ask this again then?
Yes.
Are you saying there's no times in the history of Earth, geologically, or any other fashion, where the glaciers have been completely receded far more than they are today?
Yes.
Okay, so what was the global warming at that time that created that?
So when you map the melted ice sheets and the ocean levels, and we now have pretty good records that go back about 250 million years that we've gotten from ice cores in the bottom of the ocean, and we see these fluctuations. And the great thing about it is that we can, the CO2 has been trapped. And so we can map back what was the atmospheric CO2 when the ocean was at certain levels and how much ice, and there is a unbelievable correlation. If you looked at temperature and CO2 and ocean levels, you would see an extreme.
Okay, I'm not questioning that. I'm not questioning that correlation.
I'll question the correlation.
Wait a minute, there's a question that follows that right now.
Is the warming causing the CO2 increase, or the CO2 causing the warming increase? You really can't tell that from the ice cores.
No,
so you're kind of begging the question.
No, it's a little bit like a dysfunctional marriage. Do you blame the husband or the wife? And the answer is, well,
you blame them both.
You blame them both. You blame them both, and sometimes she starts it, and sometimes he starts it. And
he should have said yes, dear. We know this.
Yes,
the yes,
right,
dear
yeah.
clause.
So it is.
Okay.
There are times when CO2 has caused changes in the planet, and there are times when CO2 has been the
Because you have
result.
a
Okay, well, let me go back.
cycle.
Let me
Right.
ask the
Warms up,
the
it's gonna
question,
exchange
because
carbon.
you've just actually given a set of scientific evidence from your perspective, because you are an expert in this field. But when we go back in time,
Yes.
and the glaciers did not exist or barely existed,
Yes.
there was no man-made pollution that made that happen.
Yes.
Where was the CO2 coming from that allegedly created the shrinking of the glaciers? And then what changed over what it could be? We're talking about a long period of time. We're not
Long
talking.
period of
It's
time.
not short periods of time.
Right.
And so what your argument is, the glaciers are getting smaller faster as compared to they're just getting smaller.
Right. We also know they're getting much faster than we've ever seen in the historic record, but we also know what the two big drivers in the historic record are. And today we should be getting bigger glaciers and going into an ice age if man had not existed on the planet. And the two big drivers have to do with the orbital geometry, how close we are to the sun and our angle to the sun, and the movements of the continents.
Well,
And
oh, I'm sorry.
go ahead. Anyway.
No, I was going to say, are there any actions by the sun that would increase this as well, as opposed to just saying we're burning too many fossil fuels?
Well, our understanding of our orbital geometry, we should be slipping into an ice age. We are at the point in the normal cycle, and this is why in the 50s and the 60s, people began to worry about us going back into an ice age, because that's what should be happening. But there is zero danger about us slipping into an ice age at the moment, given the massive amount of stuff that we've burned. If we start burning everything tomorrow, there'd be no danger of going back
Okay, then
into an ice age.
you're stating that global geometry is what caused the ice. Orbital geometry. And I apologize for that.
No, that's
I'm
right.
not an expert in this field.
I shouldn't even interrupt on that.
No, because anyway, but I understood your point. Right. It was a very good point, and that's why I'm trying to understand. You're saying now that orbital geometry is what caused the ice ages to the North-South Pole to shrink to begin with, and because of that, our orbital geometry today dictates that our poles should not be shrinking as fast as they're shrinking now.
They should be getting bigger.
Okay, so it's the exact opposite of what happened in the past.
Of what would if human beings had died out a couple hundred years ago, we would expect that we would be seeing more ice on the planet now, not less.
Okay, well let's look at this from another angle. Okay, so there's global positioning in reference to the sun, and then there's your natural patterns of glaciers and that kind of thing, and then you have man-made or not man-made effects. But let's think about this just for a second and think about, okay, so we've got the glaciers that may be melting. We've got CO2 that's obviously increasing. And so we have, the question is whether that's man-made or not, and how serious that affects.
Well, before we go to that question, I think what we have to do is realize our time is really limited here tonight. And I invite you back, because I think what we need to do is really hone in on some of these points, because you make excellent points. And I want those points supported with a little more data, and I'd like to invite you back. Are you willing to come back? Would you like to come back to our show?
All right.
Well, I will tell you, thank you so much for coming in tonight.